Hello, cruel, cruel world. My name is Dr. Shaham Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist and an NHS doctor. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. Okay, so Jeffrey Dahmer was an American serial killer and a sex offender who committed the murder and dismemberment of 17 boys and men between the years of 1978 and 1991. He was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and a psychotic disorder, as well as OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. All of this happened during his trial by some, but crucially not all, of the expert witness psychiatrists. Yet despite all of this, he was found to be legally sane. So as a forensic psychiatrist, I work as an expert witness. And one aspect of my job is to decide if the defendants have a mental illness. And if they do, if this drives their behaviour, including their offending. So one interesting aspect, in my view, of the Jeffrey Dahmer case is what happened at his trial. So how come some experts said that he had these multiple psychiatric diagnoses, yet other experts said that he had no mental illness at all? How can you kind of piece those videos together? So that's the inspiration of me making this video, plus numerous people have reached out suggesting that I should do this ish. So in this video, my Psych for Sore guys and gals, my aim is to teach you to look at all of those things that I've talked about through the lens, through the perspective of a forensic psychiatrist, and also to a degree to take over the world, but we will come on to that. So in this video, I'm going to answer the questions: does Jeffrey Dahmer's behaviour in itself indicate mental illness? So forget personality traits, I'm talking about the killing, the dismembering. Does that mean he was mentally ill automatically? What were the diagnoses that Dahmer was given, and what are the features of each of these diagnoses? My professional opinion as an expert witness as to why so many of the psychiatrists disagreed, and crucially but hypothetically, if Jeffrey Dahmer was diagnosed with a mental illness, could he be rehabilitated? So could he have been sent to hospital instead of prison? What would his future have looked like? Let's get into all of those things. Welcome to A Psych for Sore Minds. Okay, so Jeffrey Dahmer was also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster. As I'm sure you'll know, he was an American serial killer and sex offender who committed the murder and dismemberment, as I said earlier, 17 boys and men between 1978 and 1981. If you are a true crime fan, then you will almost certainly know that he's recently caught the public attention with a Netflix drama Dahmer. Obama, Llama, Farmer, Karma, Charmer. Sorry. He's recently caught the public attention with the Netflix drama Dahmer, where Dahmer is played by Quicksilver. So I'm going to give you a 1 minute, very quick summary of his background, just to put everything in context. Dahmer was initially convicted of 15 murders, which he had committed in Wisconsin, and he was sentenced to 15 life terms of imprisonment. This all happened in February 1992, and then later on he was sentenced to a 16th homicide committed in Ohio in 1978. So one definitely macabre, sinister, and downright disgusting aspect of this whole scenario is that many of his later murders involved cannibalism, and they also involve that N-word, you know, the thing that I'm not allowed to say because the YouTube algorithm is very easily offended. You know, not that N-word, obviously. I mean the other N-word, you know, rhymes with Schmecrophilia. So that's one part, and also the permanent preservation of body parts. So he typically liked to keep souvenirs, liked to keep parts of skeletons. On November the 28th, as you probably know, 1994, Dahmer was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institute in Wisconsin. Okay, so that's a bit of background. Let's dive into the meaty, the juicy, the interesting bit, the medico-legal stuff. Psychiatric evidence was given during his trial, and this is my area of expertise. I've given evidence like this. I've even occasionally done cases of the N-word. Not that N-word, this N-word. So the attorneys at Dahmer's trial debated. Some said that Dahmer had a mental illness or a personality disorder. The prosecution claimed that he might have had disorders, but none of this deprived Dahmer of the ability to appreciate his criminality or his conduct and they wouldn't have deprived him of the ability to resist his impulses. And all of that, what I've just said, is very important, and I will come back to that later on in this video. The defense argued that Dahmer suffered from a mental disease and he was driven by these obsessions and these impulses, and basically he was unable to control his actions. 3 defense experts, forensic psychiatrists, all diagnosed Dahmer with the N-word, and they argued that Dahmer was insane to have the compulsions that he had to, how do I put this without triggering the algorithm, to be over-amorous with his corpses, let's put it that way. One particular defense expert said that he had borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, alcohol dependence, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and a psychotic disorder. And I will explain what all of those things mean. I'm going to break all of those things down for you later on in this video. Just calm down, patience, my young Padawan. We will get to it. However, the expert psychiatrist who testified on behalf of the prosecution, surprise, surprise, Cilla Black, they said that Dahmer was without any mental disease or defect at the time that he committed the murders. They described Dahmer as calculating, cold, cunning individual who was able to differentiate between right and wrong, who did have the ability to control his actions, and whose lust overpowered his morals. The final witness for the prosecution was a forensic psychiatrist, one of my brethren, named Park Dietz. And he testified that he did not believe that Dahmer had any form of mental defect at the time he committed the crime. And Dietz says, and I quote, Dahmer went to great lengths to be alone with his victim and to have no witnesses. And then Dietz explained that there was ample evidence that Dahmer prepared in advance for each murder, and therefore his crimes weren't impulsive. Dietz did concede that paraphilias, so that's a catch-all mental disorder phrase for everything that encompasses the N-word, not that N-word, was not a matter of personal choice for Dahmer. And he stated that Dahmer's habit of becoming intoxicated prior to committing each of the murders was significant. Why was it significant? Because, as Dietz testified, and I quote, if he had an impulse to kill or a compulsion to kill, he would have to drink to overcome it. He only has to drink alcohol to overcome it because he is inhibited against killing. So basically my interpretation of what Dietz is saying is that Dahmer had these impulses, but he could control them, at least to a degree. And he used alcohol so that he could get over this, so he didn't have to control them. By the way, Dietz to me is a fascinating character because in another case, he gave false testimony, and a woman called Andrea Yates was facing life imprisonment because of the evidence that Dietz gave as a prosecution expert, that it was false. So it was wrong. It was clinically wrong. Some of it was factually wrong. So she killed her 5 children when she was psychotic. She was completely unwell. She should have got the insanity plea and went to a psychiatric unit, in my view, which is what happened eventually. But because of Dietz's evidence originally, she was sent to prison on 5 murder charges. It's a fascinating case. I've done another video on this channel where I deep dive into it. Always be plugging. And I will put the link of that in the Schmecrophilia below. Okay, back to the Dahmer case. Other theories that were kind of put forward during his trial, not diagnoses, but like theories of his behavior, were that the murder were all the results of this like pent-up aggression within himself, and also that Dahmer killed the men that he chose because he wanted to kill the source of his homosexual attraction to them. So he was ashamed of being homosexual. And remember, this was at a time where people couldn't, well, it was very much frowned upon in society. Things have obviously moved on for the better since then. But the theory is, in killing them, Dahmer killed in them what he hated about himself. And another theory that he was longing for companionship in many different ways, and he killed people because he found some sort of connection, some sort of companionship in corpses. And by the way, an independent expert who was neither for the defense or the prosecution described Dahmer as the following, and I quote, amiable, pleasant to be with, courteous, a sense of humor, conventionally handsome and charming in manner. He was and still is a bright young man. That's what the dude said. It's like, geez, get a room. Actually, it's Dahmer, don't get a room, not going to end well. So, in the closing arguments of the trial, the defense attorney said that mental health professionals had agreed that Dahmer was afflicted with a mental disease, and they tried to portray him as a desperate, lonely, and profoundly sick individual who was, and I quote, so out of control he couldn't help his behavior. whereas the attorney for the prosecution described Dahmer as a sane man in full control of his actions who simply strove to avoid detection. He was a calculating individual who killed to control his victims and retained their bodies so that he can afford himself a prolonged period of sexual pleasure. So what happened in the end? Well, Dahmer was convicted. The court reconvened to hear the verdict. He was ruled to be sane and not suffering from a mental disorder for each of those 15 killings. So that's the outcome. The court basically didn't buy what the defense was saying and went with the prosecution. Okay, right, so that is all the background research that I've done for you, by which I mean I looked at Wikipedia. Now the interesting bit, I'm going to use my expertise and my experience to dissect the medico-legal issues to educate all y'all. So the first question, why is there this disparity in the prosecution evidence from the experts versus the defense? And this is something I see all the time in my clinical practice. So every psychiatric expert, in fact, any expert in a criminal case should be 100% objective, neutral. They should not lean their opinion towards the side that pays them. So even though they might be instructed by the defense, by the prosecution, they are supposed to give their evidence for the court. They're supposed to help the court understand the scientific areas of their expertise that the courts don't have. But the very fact, and I'm not just talking about the Dahmer case, I'm talking about cases all the time that I see, pretty much every single case I can think of. Generally speaking, actually that's not true, not every single case, that's not true, I take that back, but 80-90% of the cases. Generally speaking, the defense leans towards the defense, so they're quite sympathetic psychiatrically in terms of the diagnoses, the defense and the prosecution are not. And this is basically because there's a fault in the system, in my view. There are cowboy experts, and because they get money, they get fame, they get attention, like Yates did, they become sort of mini celebrities in their own way. So they want to kind of keep that going, so they know that they'll get re-instructed, they get more cases if they lean a certain way. So that's one thing I think. Another thing is that Dahmer has been diagnosed with lots of personality disorders, and it's very possible to have traits, so to have features of a personality disorder. In fact, very many people, myself included, almost certainly you, will have some traits of a personality disorder, but that doesn't make it a diagnosis. You need to have like a number of traits stacked up to get a diagnosis. So what I'm saying is it's very feasible that Dahmer had lots of traits, and the argument wasn't about whether traits existed, it's about whether enough existed for him to cross the threshold of a diagnosis. Now we'll get into the diagnoses a bit later. Okay, next kind of issue, next point. Some of you, I imagine, will be watching this and thinking, of course Dahmer is mentally ill. How could he not be mentally ill? 17 murders. He's got the bodies, he's been cutting them, sexual gratification, he's been doing all kinds of things to the corpses. No normal person can behave like that. So surely he is mentally ill. So what I'm asking is, does his actions in itself cause mental illness? And if so, does that affect his criminal responsibility? Okay, I would break it down like this. There are 3 definitions for somebody being insane. There is exactly what I've just talked about. So doing something that's kind of extreme that the average person wouldn't do, that we all have moral and ethical and social boundaries to stop us doing. By that definition, almost every paedophile, every terrorist, every serial offender, all of these people are insane, right? By that definition. But that's not how a psychiatrist would see it. So that's just having extreme ideas and carrying out those extreme ideas. Then there's the psychiatrist's definition of insanity. We wouldn't use the term insanity, but of a mental illness, and that's usually a diagnosable mental illness. So you have to have certain symptoms. So for example, if it's a psychosis, you have to be hearing voices, having delusions. So it has to be it has to fit into a diagnostic category, right? And the third definition of insanity, which I would argue is the most important, especially in this context, is the legal definition of insanity. So in the UK, you've got not guilty by reason of insanity. That's a psychiatric plea. So the legal definition, I'm not going to go into all the medico-legal criteria because it'll be too long a video, but basically what it boils down to is, despite any symptoms they may or may not have had, did their mental state mean that the defendant didn't know what they were doing? So in Jeffrey Dahmer's case, he literally didn't know that he was killing and dismembering bodies. Really, really, really unlikely that would be the case. Or didn't know what they were doing was wrong. So if, hypothetically speaking, this is not the case in Jeffrey Dahmer, but hypothetically speaking, if he had the voice of God, say he had like schizophrenia or something, and he felt compelled to do God's bidding because he felt that he had to do that and that was more important than the law than anything else, or if he had paranoid delusions that if he didn't do what he did to those people and to the bodies, then the world would end, for example, then, and if the defence could prove that, then you could say he's got psychiatric defence. So that's the insanity plea. Just very briefly, there's diminished responsibility, which is, as it sounds, is like not full responsibility is taken away, but some of the responsibility is taken away. That's specifically for murder, and that changes it to manslaughter. So all of what I'm trying to say is that the legal definition is all about whether the defendant, it's not about the individual symptoms, it's about did those symptoms cause the defendant to not be criminally responsible. And that's the most important part. That's the most important definition in this particular context. So what I'm trying to say is that there's two completely different concepts. Mental illness, criminal responsibility, they're not the same thing. They get conflated all the time. It's not enough to have just one. One has to directly affect the other. And this is exactly why you need an expert witness, a forensic psychiatrist like myself. And it's complicated, the work we do is complicated, and there's two reasons that I'd say it's complicated. The first reason is because we do a very detailed assessment. So in Dahmer's case, we'll be looking at all the evidence, any surviving victims, looking at their witness statements, looking at CCTV footage, looking at police interviews, looking at psychiatric records, observing the defendant once he's been arrested, if he's in prison or in a psychiatric unit. So using all of this evidence to see what their behaviour and what their symptoms are and what their thought processes are. So that's the first reason to say it's complicated. Second reason is because I'd like to make my job sound difficult, make me sound more clever than I actually am. But what I would say is the threshold to get the insanity plea or even diminished responsibility, any psychiatric defence, so the threshold for an expert witness to say that the defendant wasn't responsible for their actions is high. So it's not just enough to have these symptoms, they've really got to be overpowering all your thoughts, all your actions, all your behaviours. And as I say, the threshold's high, so the vast majority of time when I work as an expert witness, whether it's for the defence or the prosecution, the vast majority of the time, I think that people, even some people with mental illnesses, are criminally responsible. So just to put this all into context, I'm going to expand on that point about criminal culpability. So I'm going to give you two extremes. Pay attention, nerds. Here comes the science. So one extreme, I've mentioned her before in this video, Andrea Yates. As I said, Dr. Yates gave some very dodgy testimony on her behalf. So she was compelled, she had these delusional beliefs that her children were marked by the devil. So she felt compelled to end their lives because she felt it's the only way that she could stop them going to hell. Plus she, in her delusional state, believed that if she didn't kill her 5 children, that the devil would return to earth. And we know that not just because she said it at the time, but because there was a long history of these beliefs. She'd been in and out of hospital many, many times. She said them consistently. She didn't try and hide her actions like Dahmer did. She immediately phoned the police, immediately phoned her husband after she did what she did. So that is one extreme example of somebody who's not criminally responsible. As I said, go check out my video on her. As another extreme, say you had somebody, a very common case that I would see, somebody who commits domestic violence and they might have depression, they might have substance abuse. They've still got those illnesses in the background, but they didn't control their actions. So they would be criminally culpable. Most patients fit somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. Okay, moving on. What were the diagnoses that Jeffrey Dahmer was given and what are the features of each of these? Before I tell you that, I just want to introduce you to this channel. You're watching A Schmike for Small Minds. It is basically a smorgasbord of topics related to mental illness with a little sprinkling of offending. So I cover high-profile cases, done something about incels recently. There's going to be something about Fred West and Road West on my channel soon. What else have I talked about? Jimmy Savile, R. Kelly, all of these things. If you're interested in knowing psychoanalysis of individuals, go and check that stuff out. I implore you to subscribe to my channel. Not only does it help me out immeasurably, but if you subscribe, I guarantee that you'll never accidentally bite into a burger, spill ketchup all over your shirt, ruins the whole shirt fit you good. If you subscribe, I guarantee that will never happen again, or your money back. Okay, let's get back on with the video. So I'm not going to go through all the features of all the diagnoses because it would just be too long. I'm just going to summarize and kind of draw out the main bits in my psychiatric opinion. Let's get started. So borderline personality disorder. The main kind of features of this is an unstable affect. So that means that your mood is constantly changeable, variable. You don't really feel emotions particularly deeply. If you're happy, you're not happy for a long period of time. Fear of abandonment. So you'll go to extreme kind of measures not to be abandoned, for example, within relationships. Explosive arguments, turbulent relationships, self-harm, impulsive acts, being very sort of emotionally reactive. These are all features of borderline personality disorder. By the way, if you're interested in that as a diagnosis, go check out my separate video on Amber Heard and her diagnosis and how that might have affected her behaviour towards Johnny Depp. Always be plugging. So when I think about the borderline symptoms, I think it's possible to shoehorn some of those features at stretch into Dahmer's behaviour. So for example, you could say that fear of abandonment, he kept body parts, there's a connection there. Explosive arguments, impulsive, that might have explained some of the time where he lost his temper. But then the counter argument, as Yates very reasonably pointed out, is that they were calculated and he was prepared. So I guess what I'm saying is it's a bit tenuous, that diagnosis, personally. Another one is schizotypal personality disorder. So people who suffer from this are quite odd, they're eccentric, they usually have very few, if any, kind of close relationships or friends. They don't really understand, they don't fit into society, they don't understand how relationships form or the impact of their behaviours on others. So they're kind of intentionally unaware. They often misinterpret others' motivations and behaviours, and they develop a significant mistrust of other people. So because of that, they tend to be loners, they tend to avoid social situations. And I think it's fair to say that Dahmer was certainly seen as odd, seen as a bit of an outsider. He was basically a bit of a loner, a bit of a weirdo. So I think he definitely has some of these features. Then there's alcohol dependence, which is known as alcoholism on the streets. Obviously, alcoholism, alcohol dependence is associated with a high level of consumption. You don't need a handsome forensic psychiatrist to tell you that, but it's more than that. It's like daily use. It is experiencing withdrawal symptoms. So when you don't drink for a prolonged period, then you get these withdrawal symptoms, nausea, sweating, shaking, and people who have dependent syndrome will drink in the morning usually to avoid these symptoms. Then other features would be people wanting to cut down on their alcohol use, making unsuccessful attempts, feeling a strong kind of craving or this urge to drink all the time. Another feature would be failure to fulfill major obligations such as working, going to school, or having a good home family life because of their repeated alcohol use. I suppose thinking about it, you could argue that Dahmer was actually able to fulfill his obligations as a serial killer despite the drinking. By the way, I've done a whole series on alcohol, how it affects mental health and causes criminality. Always be plugging. Then there's the N-word, Schmecrophilia. I mean, come on, you know what Schmecrophilia is. I'm not going to go through the features, so I don't want to get cancelled by YouTube, but I will tell you that it is classified as a paraphilia by the World Health Organization in the ICD-10 manual. It's also in the DSM, and it's basically a compulsion to do unspeakable things to the deceased, let's put it that way. Then there's the psychotic disorder. So I mentioned this earlier. Period of psychosis is stepping outside of reality. So if Dahmer had these symptoms, then he might have been hearing voices, he might have had these paranoid delusions, as I mentioned before. OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, I think they argued that Dahmer had a very kind of orderly way of doing things, the way he treated and disposed of the bodies. But that's not really in itself OCD. OCD is like frequent obsessive and compulsive behavior. So an obsession is like an unwanted and unpleasant thought or image or urge that repeatedly kind of enters your mind and it causes you to feel anxiety or disgust or unease. Compulsion is like a repetitive behavior or a mental act that you feel that you just have to do to bring you temporary relief, and it's to relieve the unpleasant feelings brought along by an obsessive thought. Just like me saying that you've got the compulsion to press the subscribe button right now, go press it, go. Was he psychotic? I think his defense team Dahmer's defense team tried to argue that something was controlling him, that there's some sort of delusion of control, but it didn't really wash. Okay, so the crux of the matter is, as I've alluded to before, it doesn't matter what the diagnosis is or to what degree it has the symptoms, it's whether they're in control of their actions. I told you about the insanity defense before. Diminished responsibility is like a lesser psychiatric defense, so you're partially responsible, not fully responsible, so you don't get charged for murder, you get manslaughter. Medical legal criteria are complicated, but they boil down to having a mental illness where you can't understand your conduct, you can't form a rational judgment, or you can't exhibit self-control. Those are the three kind of categories. So if the defense can prove that the mental illness caused the defendant to not be able to do one of those things, then you can get that defense. But because most of Dahmer's diagnoses of personality disorders, it's very unlikely, it's not impossible, but it's very unlikely that the judge or the court would have accepted those things as controlling his actions or not letting him know what he was doing. At a stretch, psychosis, yes, psychosis, in my clinical experience as an expert witness, very often gets used as a reason for the insanity plea when it works. But again, as I've said, there's only a very weak argument that Dahmer had a psychotic illness and it wasn't accepted by the court. Hypothetically speaking, as I said, if he had a delusional belief that he had to kill and dismember these bodies to save the world, that would have been an example where it potentially could have worked. Okay, so final question. I know you guys are getting tired. Thank you for sticking with me. If Jeffrey Dahmer was diagnosed with a mental illness and if the court accepted that he was not criminally culpable, why does it matter? What would the outcome have been? In theory, he should have gone to, if that had been accepted, which it hadn't been, if it had, in theory, he should have gone to a psychiatric hospital for rehabilitation, for the right medications, etc., etc. But the reason I said in theory is because in practice, he's so risky that I don't think he ever would have been released. Somebody that has done something like this 17 times is just too high risk. So even if he had those psychotic delusions and he got antipsychotic medications and those delusions disappeared and he appeared on the surface to be safe, because of what he did, he was so risky that no forensic psychiatrist in their mind would discharge him. And it's ultimately our decision when he gets discharged. So what I'm saying is, what would be the point? Why would you use the resource of rehabilitating a mentally disordered offenders in a specialist unit, like a high secure unit like Broadmoor, the American equivalent of Broadmoor? Why would you do that if you're never going to release him? It's just a waste of resources. So I guess my answer would be that in theory, he could be rehabilitated, but in practice, he's too risky to ever be released. So why rehabilitate if you're not going to release? Hope that makes sense. Okay, so we come to the end of this episode. To conclude, the take-home message, the most important thing of everything I've said, is that these two contradictory big misconceptions. Number one, Dahmer must be insane by the way he acted. Number two, he shouldn't be diagnosed with a mental illness as he should take full responsibility for his actions. Those are two kind of opposing schools of thoughts. And with the utmost respect, they're kind of both wrong in a way. To expand, his behaviours in themselves do not explain that he's mentally ill. He might be doing something extreme, unpalatable, unimaginable, but unless he's actually got symptoms of a mental disorder, then that in itself is not mentally unwell. As I said before, many offenders have some sort of background diagnosis, but that doesn't mean that they're not responsible for their actions. So it's not about just the symptoms, it's about how the symptoms affect their thoughts and behaviours, and crucially whether they control those thoughts and behaviours. And as I've said a couple of times in this video, the vast majority of the time offenders can control their behaviours and therefore they don't have this psychiatric defence. Exactly for all of these complicated reasons is why you need a specific detailed assessment by a gold-toothed, sharp haircutted forensic psychiatrist who never skips leg day. So the majority do not reach this threshold. The majority of people do know what they're doing. The vast majority of offenders, even with background mental illnesses, do know what they're doing. And when they don't know what they're doing, when they do get to go to hospital for rehabilitation, it's usually, most of the time, in the context of a psychotic disorder. Whew, that's enough from me. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Hope it's been educational. Put your schmomments in the schmomment spectrum below, because I'd love to know what you think. Did I miss anything out you think that's relevant in terms of Dahmer's diagnoses? Let me know. Until next time, buy my goddamn book, stay euthymic, and do not forget, I love you.